Hi everyone, and welcome to another one of our podcasts on the Tony Tompkins Show. Glad you could be with me, and of course, as always, I have Dr Dee Michell with me. No surprise there.
There was a story yesterday about the broken child protection system in New South Wales, and I just have to say that I never think these systems are broken. I actually think they've been ill-designed from the start, so I just want to make that. Anyway, that's the title of it, this broken New South Wales child protection system. And the article is about New South Wales, but I wanted to come back to South Australia in a minute. There's a woman there who's finally, after 20 years, and if we had a conversation, I'd love to ask her why it took her 20 years to speak out, but she finally got to the point where she couldn't bear working in the New South Wales child protection system anymore, so she's resigned and she now has spoken out. And she says, and I quote, that while it could be difficult to hear and see what was happening to children in their own homes, she felt the welfare system was also abusive to them, and that's the ABC's quotation marks. The New South Wales government last week revealed that more than 400 children in New South Wales were being put in hotels, motels and caravan parks, supervised by a rotating roster of staff in high-cost emergency care arrangements. If you could just imagine what it would be like for your 3 or 5-year-old to be looked after by constantly changing adults you have no relationship with, Ms. Huber said. And after a period of being separated, the agency placed this child, Ray, and his 3 siblings in one household in October 2023, where more than 10 people provided care for them. So now the magistrate who was looking at this case said there was nothing appropriate about the arrangement. But what I wanted to talk to you about, it's been bothering me, funnily enough, ever since the Ben Robert Smith case, but that might seem entirely irrelevant. I had an epiphany that
There's
day.
a divergence.
That's a divergence, but that's kind of irrelevant. What I was thinking about the balance of probability argument that was put forward last year in his case, that on the balance of probability he was a murderer, is a murderer.
Yeah, and the same with Lemon's case.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think I had asked you about, it was the balance of probability point that I was interested in. And we had a discussion, and I asked you about how the magistrate in the children's court make decisions, at least in South Australia, it might be different elsewhere, at least in South Australia, how they make decisions about when a child should be removed from their family. And you said to me it was on the balance of probability that the parent couldn't care appropriately for the child.
Yeah.
Right. But there's nothing about the state. So my issue is that the Department of Child Protection lawyers come in, they argue that on the balance of probability this child needs to be removed because the parents aren't caring for them. But the state never has to argue that on the balance of probability they can do a better job of looking after that child.
Yeah, that's right, because there's a number of reasons for this. I think the first reason is that there's not the legislation that supports the notion that the state may not be doing a good job, that they may actually be shitty in what they're doing. The legislation is geared towards the parents being shitty parents.
So the underlying assumption has been always, what, that the state's a better parent?
Yeah.
And yet the evidence over at least 100 years, more than that, is that they're not.
Well, the state, I guess the point is that the state is assigned the responsibility to care for children who are unsafe.
Yes.
So that's clearly defined within the legislation. But there's lots of things in the legislation that they don't consider, which they should. Number one is the major decision makers around what happens to children are social workers. Social workers don't even get a mention in the legislation, right? The other carers for kids are obviously foster parents. They don't get a mention. Kinship carers don't get a mention. So all of the people
So
that
who
are
does?
the state.
Just the state.
Just the state. Yeah. So the state is lumbered with the task of caring for kids in an environment which does not care for them. And the magistrate, the point I want to make is that the magistrate is restricted by the legislation. So in order for them to look at the care of the state, you'd need to have some significant changes to the legislation that would encompass a whole lot of care arrangements. So they'd have to start looking at where's the kid going to go, who are they going to live with, how long are they likely to live there, what are their behavioural issues that have to be addressed, are there people that are appropriately trained to be able to care for those children?
Yes.
There's a
So I
plethora.
take your point about the legislation, but don't you think they're appropriate things for somebody to be asking?
You can only
remove the parents. And I appreciate the limitations, but shouldn't that legislation therefore be changed? And
yeah, well, the only
why
way.
hasn't it been changed, given that we've had untold inquiries?
Well, because the government, the parliamentarians, and others don't see those gaps. They're blind
They
to
don't
those
connect
gaps.
the dots.
No, they don't. They
They
don't.
still make this.
We as professionals have been talking about this for decades.
Yeah, for decades. Yes.
And nothing. One of my biggest frustrations, I guess, is that nothing's ever changed in that space, and that is because somehow, if you took it away, if you started to look outside the government, you're going to have a whole lot of spaces in which it's vacant. There's I don't know how to put it. There's this unknown concept that firstly, should communities be responsible for children, right? Should other care arrangements be the key issues here, apart from just the government looking after these kids? Indigenous kids, for example, being looked after by their community. So there's lots of areas in which the government would refuse to go because their belief is that, they're so risk averse that they are the only ones that can have control of this, for fear it may just blow out into something out of control. The reality is, I think, that if tested, they would find that a whole lot of other arrangements
could be
made that were in the best interest of children, and that would help them to disseminate, if you like, their level of responsibility around all of this. But because they're fearful that the public will, you find that when there's a death of a kid in care, for example, the public goes bananas, the papers go crazy, becomes first front page news, and they're fearful that if they opened it out, they themselves would be open to all sorts of accusations, I guess, because it still remains that kids will be returned back to environments, and some of those kids may be harmed in those environments.
And there's a case in Queensland at the moment going ahead where children were returned to a mum who shouldn't have had those children back, and she ended up leaving them in a hot car for 8 hours or something, and the children died. So there was a case where the children should never have been returned.
Yeah.
And it looks like from...
But there are also cases of parents who just act badly and their kids die, or kids die through accidents, like in swimming pools and whatever. So there's lots of cases where kids in the other community, the non-care community, where kids...
You mean in the non-impoverished communities?
Well, not always. I think that's unfair. But certainly there are lots of kids that suffer a whole lot of other abuses, domestic violence abuses. Well, we could look at the middle class area where kids living in domestic violence that they never get heard about. That those issues around DV never get addressed because they're middle class and they have they're kind of hidden in that sense. It's not the purveying.
Yeah, what I meant by the impoverished, it's usually impoverished people, parents who get picked on by the child protection system. That's what I meant by that.
Yeah.
There will be deaths in other families.
Yeah.
Apart from those, but they're the ones who get picked on.
So the question is, how do we create a system that is safer? And we can't. No one has this, and professionals will talk about it. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know what's going to happen to this child in 10 years' time. The reality is that the history tells us, and this is factual, that kids in care have worse outcomes.
Well, that bothers me, you see, that's right. So if a magistrate was sitting there and being presented with the opportunity of either leaving the child with the children who weren't very good, with the parents who weren't very good, or removing them and putting them in a system where they're probably according to the outcomes, doesn't always happen, and we shouldn't stereotype the children, but they're more likely to end up not going on to university, ending up in the prison system, statistically, then wouldn't you think, maybe I'd have to have a second thought about moving that child?
Well, if you've got the mindset that the kids are, or the parents, I should say, are unlikely to change. So the first negative concept that often gets bandied about, I think, is that parents can't change. So if you've got an alcohol problem, a mental health problem, and there's domestic violence, whatever, you're always going to be taking drugs, you've always going to be feeling unwell about yourself mentally, and you're always going to be entering into relationships that are violent. So a lot of these false assumptions are made about parents to start with.
So can I ask you a question, heading back to that first story, that if that young man, unlikely to happen, but if that young man Keegan, who's won his $1 million, but later on didn't have the money, was about to go to court for losing his children, would they drag up the old story as Peter Stefanovic did?
Yeah, probably.
They would do the same thing, wouldn't they?
Probably, because I mean, there's many of examples of women who have had previous domestic violence relationships, and those relationships usually get highlighted as an example of the fact that they can't find appropriate relationships now, and therefore will not be able to in the future. But the problem here is that, take the example of the one you raised of the court looking at what happens to a child when they leave, right? And they go into some sort of care arrangement. But let's imagine for a moment you say we're going to put a social worker, a psychologist, a speech therapist, a mental health professional, and a parenting worker with you and with that family, and they're going to work with you for a 12-month period, and then at the end of the 12 months we're going to reevaluate and see what progress you've made, then we'll do another evaluation, you see. So let's assume, for example, they put that sort of system in place. If they did, a judge is more likely to say, okay, great, let's put them back with the family, let's not traumatise them by them being in care, they can live with and watch the family progress.
And could they continue with that team working for them?
Yeah. Well, obviously, because let's say you've got 2 kids that would ostensibly be placed in care. Well, that's around $700,000 a year to keep them in care. Doesn't it make much more sense to be able to spend between $150,000 and $200,000 on that family to ensure that those kids are no longer traumatised by being in care, but also can benefit by families that made decisions about improving the way they live?
Well, I would agree with that.
But the point is,
the system doesn't work like that, which goes back to what I was saying, that I don't think the system is broken so much as really badly designed in the first place. It was never intended to put money and support for those people who needed money and support. The solution was always rip the children away.
But they do it piecemeal.
Like sometimes they might be more supportive.
You'll have, people like myself that used to work with these families, often for free, admittedly, but you also have domestic violence services and drug and alcohol services that would put up their hand to work with these families, but they were never...
So there's no concerted team effort really amongst all those services?
No, there's not like, a whole, 4 or 5 services that are working together with this one family over a long period of time. There are these services, which there might be a drug and alcohol bloke that sort of works with them spasmodically and has them do their drug tests and whatever. There might be a mental health professional that sees them once every few months just to check up on them. There's no consistency in anything that they do. And as a result of that, but come back to your original point, the reason why all of this occurs in the way that it does is because no politician has ever really taken the time to change the system, to change the legislation that caters for all these other things we've just been talking about.
Which is probably one of the reasons why you should have gone into politics.
Well, we tried. No one was interested.
You did try.
And that's another thing.
Well, that is the other thing, isn't it? As you say, nobody's interested until there's a death.
Yeah,
of
that's
a child.
right. That's right.
Yes.
And then everybody throws their hands up in horror. And
In fact, I actually remember somebody saying that to you. Somebody who knew about the voting system said you'll never get into politics unless at the time you're running for running as a candidate, there happens to be a death of a child in care.
And it fascinates me that most people believe that the child protection system is for everybody else but them. And that they, you know, I don't know how many times, particularly grandparents who've come to said, you know, I've heard about these cases, I've heard about the Child Protection Department, but I never thought it would encompass me or capture me until such time as my grandchildren were taken. And then they're horrified.
At how it works.
And I'm thinking, well, where the fuck were you when other kids were being removed and you could have put up your hand and you could have said, I care. But no, most of the people that fight for these kids are people, with the exception of myself, I guess, but most people fight for these kids where they have had encountered the child protection system and realise how flawed it actually is.
And I guess your encounter came from being
Working with them.
working with people who'd been badly impacted.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas my interest is a little bit more personal, but I've never actually challenged the system in the way that you have. Interestingly enough.